Peter B. Collins, back in the saddle again. It's Tuesday, August 29th, 2017. I took a little vacation to the Midwest, watched the eclipse in Cincinnati, and spent some time in my old stomping grounds in northern Michigan. Glad to be back and distressed at the impact of Hurricane Harvey. And while I don't attempt to cover big stories like major storms and natural disasters, I have to say that my heart goes out to the people who are afflicted, and it isn't over, because Harvey is back in the Gulf and expected to re-hit the mainland in eastern Texas or western Louisiana, and the heavy rains continue to pile up in the region. This is a major weather event. We can't say it's directly caused by climate change, but this is the most rainfall, I believe, that has ever fallen in this period of time in North America in recorded history. And it's hard for me to believe that that is not in some way related to the climate change that we are experiencing. My top story today is one that I wasn't here in the Bay Area for on Sunday. I just flew back yesterday on Monday. But Sunday was the culmination of a weekend where right-wing protesters planned and then canceled a rally at Crissy Field, which is very close to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And there was an additional protest scheduled on Sunday in Berkeley. And I know Berkeley is a lightning rod. It's an icon for the right to provoke the left. And unfortunately, it works. And I am about to offer sharp criticism of the Berkeley Police Department's response. This is not their first rodeo with the Blac Bloc. We saw in April when an attempt by a right-wing Breitbart guy to speak at Berkeley was interrupted by protesters who were peaceful, and then that was turned upside down, upstaged, by a handful of hooded vigilantes, what we call Black Bloc or Antifa. And because they're hooded and often they don't get arrested, we don't know much about these people. We don't know if they are provocateurs from the right. We don't know if they're government-paid or influenced provocateurs, or just freelance vigilantes, or people who just like a rumble in the streets. Nevertheless, the Berkeley Police Department put 400 cops on the street, many of them in riot gear. And they set up a checkpoint, a choke point, at a park in Berkeley where the conservatives had a permit to rally. They also permitted counter-protesters, who I don't believe had a permit, to line the streets and to express themselves. And things appeared to be going okay until about 1 o'clock on Sunday, when what the description is. Let me read this to you. This is a quote from the coverage by the San Francisco Chronicle. For hours, some 400 law enforcement officers from Berkeley, Oakland, the UC cops, and Alameda County had control of the scene at the park, stopping anyone who entered at a single checkpoint, where they confiscated anything on a list of banned objects, including skateboards, eggs, and any item that could be used as a weapon. But shortly after the scheduled 1 p.m. start time of an anti-Marxism rally, hundreds of black-masked agitators arrived at the scene. Rather than trying to take on the horde, the clearly overwhelmed police force allowed hundreds of people to pass barriers and enter the park unchecked. Police spokeswoman Jennifer Coates: "We made a strategic decision to move our officers. We also want people to freely assemble. Once in, the masked agitators beat and pepper-sprayed right-wing demonstrators who were far outnumbered in the crowd. Mobs chased some of the right-wingers, a few who dressed to show their support for Trump, into the streets. Wearing gas masks on the outskirts of the park, riot officers continued to attempt to control several fights using smoke canisters." Now, they did arrest 13 people, including one on suspicion of assault with a deadly weapon. But you have to ask yourselves, how did the police miss the fact that a horde described as hundreds of hooded and masked protesters, these Antifa, Black Bloc vigilantes, were moving toward the park? Did they fail to patrol their own perimeters? Did they fail to have a helicopter or a drone up there? And, I have problems about the use of drones inappropriately. But in this case, a fixed-wing aircraft, a helicopter, some kind of aerial surveillance would make a whole lot of sense. And yet it appears they were blindsided by the arrival of these hundreds of people. And I find this inexcusable because they knew what they were confronting. And by putting 400, including those who were in riot gear, in place, it appears that they had a seriously faulty plan. And to abandon the park that they had control of to these black Bloc thugs, I simply can't find any explanation for it. And in a follow-up story in today's paper, the Chronicle is kind of excusing this. Sunday proved that no matter how well prepared they were, hundreds of police officers could not stop hundreds of anarchists from overtaking a place they were protecting. And when you look at the use of Homeland Security, the FBI's paid informants, all aimed at framing innocent or problematic cases of Muslim Americans who are accused of domestic terrorism, we don't properly use the law enforcement agencies and the authorities that have been put in place. And I, as you know, am an absolutist and extremist about the First Amendment. And I defend the rights of idiots and people with whom I have virulent disagreement to stand in a public place with people who want to hear what they have to say, and they have a right to speak. And law enforcement has the duty to provide protection for people of all viewpoints, including the liberal, unarmed counter-protesters who took to the streets of Berkeley. And while I'm not really an expert on what happened in Charlottesville, I have heard similar charges, at least on the Saturday events where the guy from Ohio drove his car and killed Heather Hyatt. And so we've got to come to grips with this. I don't believe that the Antifa or any kind of anarchist response that involves violence should be permitted. And I think that law enforcement has, as I say, a duty to use their authorities and the power that they have to block streets, to profile people as they're entering. Yep, take off that hoodie, bro. And that bandana, either put it in your pocket or I'm going to confiscate it. People have the right to assemble peacefully. And here's a case where, once again, I am loath to defend some of these individuals. But one of the people who showed up to protest was wearing a kind of defensive, protective body armor. And when he got to the park, the cops made him take that off. Now, I don't think that defensive body armor is always warranted or should be permitted. It depends on the situation. But I see self-defense as a fundamental right. And as long as the body armor isn't being used to protect somebody who's engaging in offensive, violent behavior, then I question why the cops made him remove his body armor, because moments later, the anarchists arrive. The man says they came in and the cops left. It was almost like it was choreographed. And once again, that man has a right to come to Berkeley. I do deplore that people will travel from some place to a location that they don't have any connection to. They really only know Berkeley by a kind of reputation. Some of it driven by right-wing media characterizations. But we really need to come to grips with this. And this headline at Vice News about the Berkeley protests, Antifa successfully push right-wing groups out of Berkeley. Successfully? Is Vice looking for more riot porn video footage that they can show? I find this very troubling. Now to another protest that goes back to January of this year, when many assembled in Washington, D.C. to protest the inauguration of the Trump problem. The protests were known as J20 for the date. And, as you may know, the web hosting service that delivers the Peter B. Collins podcast to you, DreamHost, has been the subject of a massive and expansive federal warrant for they started off asking for virtually every detail of the people who browsed a website for the effort to organize people. It was called Disrupt J20. And most of the people who went to that website didn't even go to Washington. But they are part of a dragnet warrant, a general warrant, that is way out of bounds. And those who are being prosecuted are being subjected to group trials because the government has what is seen as pretty weak evidence. And you can imagine that if you were kettled, that's where they use these plastic snow fences to group people together. You might be in a situation where you can commit no crime. You are nonviolent and you don't violate any other of the rules. But somebody right next to you who has just been, bundled into a group with you throws a rock or, attacks a cop or whatever happens. Well, the government is trying to put groups of strangers together and call them conspirators. And over at Shadowproof, Rokhaya Kamasadine, I'm sorry, I am not familiar with her name. She has done a great job, and I'm linking to the article here in the show file for today's podcast. They quote one of the J20 defendants, whose identity is being withheld to keep them out of further trouble, said, "I have no idea how that's supposed to work or how I can be responsible for what 7 other strangers who will be tried alongside me did. And we may file a motion to sever so I could be tried separately." One individual who was live streaming the action, which is often described as a police riot, is going to trial in November. The name is Alexei Wood, and he is attempting to have his trial severed from the group, but the government is opposing that motion. Back on January 20th, the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington kettled, detained, and levied felony charges against over 200 people. There are now 196 defendants who face as much as 80 years in prison each. And one community organizer, Carlos Piantini, who is a defendant in the state's case, wrote that the events of the day were wrought with violence, specifically by the police. Quote, "I remember the footage of an elderly woman brutalized by a river of pepper spray and saved from a phalanx of riot police by a black-clad protester. I recall a fellow arrestee in my cell unit with an eye bulging out of its socket like a tomato, the offspring of pepper spray and contact lenses, and how we had to demand that they receive medical attention." Now, that's part of the piece. The other is this incredibly expansive warrant against the web hosting company DreamHost here in California. And the judge who is presiding over this is Robert Morin, M-O-R-I-N, in D.C. Superior Court. He has upheld the controversial search warrant that would allow the government to sift through data from the protest website and the servers that hosted it. And the judge has put some restrictions and protections on the government's attempt to search this, but he, despite his claim that he's going to be supervising their search, well, this is still a very expansive and problematic approach because, as you can imagine, there are thousands, if not more, innocent people who visited that website whose constitutional rights will be undermined or directly violated in this process. A lawyer representing DreamHost said that the Disrupt J20's emails and email lists were essentially tantamount to the membership list of an advocacy group. He argued that it's unconstitutional for the government to be able to search through so many email accounts with one warrant without presenting evidence that any specific account was connected to criminal activity. What they've done here is essentially obtained a general warrant. And that is explicitly prohibited in the language of the Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, North Korea continues its provocative behavior, and they carried out one of their most successful and kind of frightening missile tests this morning, Tuesday morning, Asia time. And the missile overflew the northern island of Japan, Hokkaido, and then landed harmlessly in the sea. Now, I don't have an exact fix on how close it came to Honshu, which is the largest and the central island of the Japanese chain, and, of course, it's where Tokyo and the other major cities are located. It did not apparently have any payload. It was simply a missile test. But what's interesting is that the early reports indicate that the missile was launched from a portable launcher located near Pyongyang. And most of the missiles in recent tests have been coming from an area in northern Korea. This appears to be an effort to explain to the world and to communicate with the United States that the idea of a preemptive strike on North Korea would fail to take out all of their missile capabilities, because they're not all located in places that we know about, and these portable launchers, of course, can be moved around. So this is provocative. There's no doubt about it. Now, what is different here is that Donald Trump did not respond, at least so far, with a tweet storm of threats against Kim and North Korea. This may be his deference to reality, because there really is not a military solution. Now, he and others in the administration repeated the phrase that all options are on the table. But not all options are really available to Trump, because a preemptive strike would draw a rebuke and possible military action from China. It would violate our agreements with the South Koreans that we would not take military action without their approval. And so Trump is reduced to a more diplomatic form of bluster than he used just a few weeks ago. And it's also interesting to note that the armed forces of Japan did not try to shoot down the missile from North Korea as it entered Japanese territory. Now, they claim, well, we just didn't think it was a threat. But there was a threat that if the missile was launched toward Guam, that the U.S. would take it out. We know that missile defense has been deployed, including Patriots, in Japan because they have made a show of it for the media. And my theory is that they are afraid to expose the myth of missile defense, which you can also refer to as mythal defense, without making fun of people who lisp. Also, I want to recommend, I've linked to this article in the show file for today's podcast. Gareth Porter, the author, historian, who has covered many important conflicts, he wrote a piece that I think is a very fair recap of the recent tensions between the U.S. and North Korea. And he goes back a little further than much of the corporate media does to show the history under the Obama administration of the development of a new war plan for the Korean Peninsula called O-Plan 5015. It has been embraced by the Trump administration. Obama did not give it a green light. It was simply a contingency plan, I believe, developed by the Pentagon. Gareth Porter also notes that the Trump administration began the ratcheting up of tensions with North Korea by sending B-1 bombers from Guam to overfly the Korean Peninsula and essentially to buzz the 38th parallel to try to send a message to Kim Jong-un. Well, I guess he got the message and decided he wanted to return that kind of communication. Porter also notes that during the week of August 9th, when Trump started the Twitter assault on North Korea and used the language that he would meet any provocation with fire and fury, such as the world has never seen, well, that really ratcheted up tensions, and North Korea called the bluff with the threat on Guam. And then, notes Gareth Porter, both sides moved to turn it down a notch. taking at least a half step back from earlier statements. We heard Defense Secretary Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Hahn Tillerson say the aim of the United States is not regime change. They thought that was an important message to send to Kim Jong-un. But the U.S. insisted on going forward with these video war games that are still underway with South Korea. But, as Porter notes, we did not deploy strategic assets. It's just a screen session. So it does seem, and Porter ends on a kind of positive note here, these signs point to a possibility for negotiations in the relatively near future. That could be complicated by the missile test that was conducted today. And I'll note that Porter doesn't make any comment about the editorial in the Chinese newspaper, which we reported on and which Pepe Escobar commented on in our recent in-depth interview about the brushback from China, saying that if the U.S. attacked North Korea, the Chinese would defend the North, and that if North Korea provoked the United States, that China would stay neutral and let the U.S. have its way with North Korea. I think that was a very powerful move, and I have described it as checkmate for all concerned. Back to domestic politics. Last week, Friday night, that's when you do things you don't want people to see. And when there's a big hurricane bearing down on the Texas Gulf Coast, it's a good time to do something that you hope people, at least the wrong people, won't notice. And so in an act of authoritarian contempt for the rule of law, Trump issued a pardon for the former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, Joe Arpaio. And it's amusing. I saw the news conference yesterday where Trump defended this move, and I get the clear impression that Trump is unable to pronounce the name Arpaio because he always refers to him as Sheriff Joe. Now, we've also learned that Trump intervened at the Justice Department and tried to get them to drop the case against Joe Arpaio before it went to the jury. And I don't know who made the call, but somebody, Jeff Sessions or Rod Rosenstein, somebody at the Justice Department flatly refused, and this could be another element of obstruction of justice if a case is ever brought against Trump. But I don't have to persuade you that pardoning Joe Arpaio for his abusive treatment of prisoners under his jurisdiction, his racial profiling, his repeated arrogance, and refusal to follow court orders. You've seen the reporting that Maricopa County has paid out over the years over $140 million in settlements for wrongful behavior by the former sheriff. And so for Trump to defend his pardon, saying that Arpaio has done a great job for the people of Arizona, he's strong on borders, strong on illegal immigration, he is loved in Arizona, none of that matters. He intentionally and continuously broke the law. And to relieve him of responsibility for this, claiming, well, he's 85 years old, he's been a good American, and so we're going to pardon him. Well, now Joe Arpaio, despite his age, is threatening to run for the U.S. Senate seat that Jeff Flake is defending and that Trump is actively promoting a Republican opponent in. So, and he also defended his decision because when he went to the rally in Phoenix last week with all his rabid supporters, when he said, "What do you think of Sheriff Joe?" people went crazy. So he holds a focus group of the idiots who support him and voted for him, and that's all he needs to justify what he did. And then he went off the deep end yesterday, citing Bill Clinton's egregious pardon of Mark Rich. Yes, that was a mistake. He did it on the last day in office because he knew how stinky it was. But he also selected President Obama's commutation of the sentence of Chelsea Manning, then referred to Chelsea Manning as a male, and falsely claimed, quote, horrible, horrible thing that he did, and then, referring to Obama, commuted the sentence and perhaps pardoned. Now, there was no pardon for Chelsea Manning. Her sentence was commuted, and that was it. And this is just another example of how loose Trump is with the facts. He makes things up like he just did here. And while I acknowledge that the president has the absolute right to pardon almost anyone, questions about whether he can pardon himself, this was a really contemptible act by a man who has contempt for everyone and just about everything. And here's another example. Last week, the Trump administration announced it is going to restore the distribution of surplus military equipment to local law enforcement agencies. Obama properly suspended that after the military response in Ferguson, Missouri, and Trump doesn't care. He wants law and order, except for the people he likes. They're allowed to commit crimes, get away with it, and even earn a presidential pardon. I was distressed to learn that James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, the individuals who served as consultants to the CIA, collected over $80 million in fees, presided directly over the torture sessions of individual detainees. They reached a confidential settlement with the torture survivors who brought a civil case against them in Spokane, Washington. Now, I do applaud the ACLU and the lead attorney, Dror Layden. They brought a case. They persuaded a judge named Quackenbush to allow the case to go forward over strident objections from the CIA and from the Justice Department. He rebuffed the claims like Nazis that were made by Mitchell and Jessen. We were only following orders. Threw them out as bullshit. And as the case was about to go to trial right after Labor Day, Mitchell and Jessen blinked. Here is the agreement, the public statement that was issued. Mitchell and Jessen acknowledged that they worked with the CIA to develop a program for the CIA that contemplated the use of specific coercive methods to interrogate certain detainees. Plaintiff Gul Rahman, he died in CIA custody, was subjected to abuses in the CIA program that resulted in his death and in pain and suffering for his family. Plaintiffs Suleiman Abdullah Salim and Mohammed Ahmad Ben Sood were also subjected to coercive methods in the CIA program, which resulted in pain and suffering for them and their families. Plaintiffs assert that they were subjected to some of the methods proposed by Mitchell and Jessen to the CIA and stand by their allegations regarding the responsibility of Mitchell and Jessen. Mitchell and Jessen assert that the abuse of these men occurred without their knowledge or consent, and that they were not responsible for those actions. Mitchell and Jessen also assert they were unaware of the specific abuses that ultimately caused Rahman's death and are also not responsible for those actions. That's bullshit. They know it. We know it. And I'm sorry, because without this case going forward, not a single individual will be held responsible for the gruesome torture program. Not George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, David Addington, Cheney's lawyer, a big advocate of torture, Don Rumsfeld at the Pentagon, or the individuals who performed the torture procedures. Yes, John Kiriakou, the former CIA officer who was a lead anti-terrorism officer in Pakistan, and who later admitted that we tortured people, and who was retaliated against for that and sent to prison for 30 months. John Kiriakou remains the only individual who's gone to prison and faced real punishment for any connection to the dark side of the U.S. in this torture regime. I invite you to read Kevin Gostola's account, which does show the real complicity of these men and their direct responsibility in the cases that were brought in the trial in Washington State. Well, I took a full 10 or 12 days off of my cable news addictive viewing, and last night I got home in time to catch Rachel Maddow's show. There she was, hyperventilating and gesticulating more than I remember her doing. Her hands were flailing all over the place. And she was excited because she has found a new pile of circumstantial evidence linking Donald Trump to some Russians who knew Vladimir Putin. And the circumstantial case is, this tall. My hand is about 6 feet off the floor here. But there still is no proof that Russia meddled in our election and that they attempted to get Donald Trump elected. And what's interesting is that Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, who had to deliver under subpoena a bunch of emails and other documents to the House Intelligence Committee, and who it is suspected then leaked to the media some of the information that he found favorable to his spin version of the events. Well, what Rachel Maddow was so excited about is that Felix Sater, who we've talked about on this podcast before, and if you want the grisly details, just listen to our most recent interview with Russ Baker, the editor-in-chief at whowhatwhy.com. It's .org, I'm sorry, whowhatwhy.org, because he exposed who Felix Sater is. Felix Sater is a financial criminal. He is a man who broke a martini glass and then took the shards and shoved it into the face of a man he was having an argument with. He was convicted for that. Felix Sater is a longtime lackey of Donald Trump. And we're told that he was not on the Trump payroll. He was not officially linked to the Trump organization. In 2015, when he wrote a series of emails to Michael Cohen, and they're tight buddies, and Cohen is considered like a son to Donald Trump. At least that's what we're told. Well, Sater was bluffing and bragging and boasting because he was trying to come up with a scheme to revive a deal that had stalled. It appeared to be dead, to build a Trump hotel in Moscow. So Sater is saying, I will get Putin on this program, we'll get Donald elected. If he says it, we own this election. America's most difficult adversary agreeing that Donald is a good guy to negotiate. And the New York Times and the Washington Post have both been writing big headlines about the exposure of this deal. And let me stipulate, Donald Trump is dirty, and he's dirty with Russians, including Felix Sater, including the deal with the oligarch who purchased a home that Trump owned in Florida where he'd never lived for double or almost triple what Trump had paid for it. Yes, he is dirty. But it doesn't prove that Russia meddled in the election last year and that Trump knew about it. And even the New York Times story that presents these salacious developments says there is no evidence in the emails that Mr. Sater delivered on his promises, and one suggests that Sater overstated his Russian ties. In January of 2016, Cohen wrote to Putin's spokesman asking for help to restart the Trump Tower project, but Cohen didn't even have the email address for Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman, and he sent it to the general inbox at the Kremlin communications office. And then the New York Times admits the project never got government permits or financing, and it died weeks later. There's also this kind of interesting claim here that is a denial that I can only believe is an attempt to protect the overarching Trump-Russia narrative embraced by the Times, the Post, and NBC. The emails obtained by the Times make no mention of Russian efforts to damage Hillary Clinton's campaign or the hacking of Democrats' emails. And can we add, it also included no recipe for borscht, no combination for the door code at one of Putin's dashes in Sochi. I mean, this is such bizarre stuff. And for a reality check, I have linked to Robert Perry's takedown of these claims published at Consortium News today, because he says that these newly released emails actually show that Trump's team has little or no influence in Moscow. And what he describes is similar to my characterization. The boasting from Felix Sater that somehow the construction of a Trump Tower in Moscow would demonstrate Trump's international business prowess and thus help him win the election was meaningless. And keep in mind that the way Trump has operated in recent years is he doesn't own the hotels that he has his name on. He simply licenses his name to whoever does own it. And so Sater claimed that he had lined up financing for the Trump Tower deal. And Rachel Maddow made a big deal that it was with VTB Bank, which is 60% owned by the Russian government. And Perry just shoots it down in a very, very credible way. He says none of Sater's boastful claims proved true, and this incident really underscored the lack of useful connections between Trump's people and the Kremlin. And I saw a later program on MSNBC last night where they recapped all of the stuff related to the Donald Trump Jr. meeting with the Russian lawyer at Trump Tower. And there was no mention that in a separate stream, a young staffer who was trying to build his own cred in the Trump campaign repeatedly proposed contacts with Russia, and even Paul Manafort, the guy with the deep connections to Russia, flatly rejected them. And what Bob Perry points out is that when information services that doesn't support the Russiagate narrative, well, they just kind of walk around that. I encourage you to read Perry's piece. It's very interesting. Also exposes the exaggeration related to how RT, Russia Today, was able to allegedly buy the loyalty of the first Trump National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. The latest leak in Washington from NBC News apparently comes from somewhere inside the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation at the Justice Department. And they say that the investigators are now focused on whether Trump himself participated in the drafting of the misleading memo that Jr. used to try to explain away his meeting with the Russians at Trump Tower last June in New York. And also related to all of the bloviating coverage of the Trump-Russia meme, you may know about Louise Mensch. She served a term in the British Parliament. She's married to a guy who manages rock bands here in the United States. And she has been blogging about the Trump-Russia stuff, and the New York Times and others have cited her work. Well, she and a writing partner named Claude Taylor have been badly burned. And the woman who created the hoax that they failed to verify or properly vet and went public with has now exposed their bad reporting. The individual whose name we don't know, but she used a cover name. I think it was Caitlin. Yes, Caitlin. The Guardian writes, the source falsely claimed to be an official named Caitlin in the office of New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. She shared details of her hoax on condition of anonymity with the Guardian to avoid retaliation from followers of Taylor and Mensch. The Guardian verified her true identity and confirmed that she's not named Caitlin and she doesn't work for Schneiderman. And what she did was feed them some lies. That there was a grand jury sealed indictment related to Trump's operation of a talent or modeling agency and the implication that it engaged in some sort of human trafficking. So the hoaxer said that she contacted Taylor. Taylor asked no questions to verify my identity, did no vetting whatsoever, sought no confirmation from a second source, but instead asked leading questions to support his various theories, asking me to verify them. Now, Taylor has posted a mea culpa, quote, as a citizen journalist, I acknowledge my error and do apologize. He worked in the Obama White House. He has 200,000 followers on Twitter, and Louise Mensch has 267. She's wiggling out of this, saying that she made allegations about Trump's model agency, but they came from her own sources. And asked why she had retweeted her pal Taylor's false posts, she said, "I don't think anybody can vet anybody else's sources." And I bring this up not to embarrass Mensch or Taylor, but to caution you to be skeptical. Because Mensch and Taylor were burned by an anonymous source, a leaker. Almost everything, except for Trump Jr.'s email thread, that is being used to support this huge theory, this conspiracy theory of Russia meddling in the election, Russia hacking the DNC, Russia giving that information to WikiLeaks, and that Putin personally directed all this. Well, these conspiracy theories are no more credible than the false reporting that we can now attribute to Mensch and Taylor. And when we have the fascinating and credible evidence that the DNC hack was not a hack, but a leak by an insider, and that it could have been Seth Rich. And the corporate media tells us if you mention Seth Rich, you are a conspiracy theorist. Well, we have to remain skeptical, and we have to demand that all leads be investigated, because that's the only way we will get to the truth. And finally today, I don't have much time to add details, but Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka were bounced from Trumpland while I was away on vacation. I celebrate their departures. I wonder what kind of damage Steve Bannon will do back at Breitbart. I have no idea what kind of damage Sebastian Gorka is capable of outside the White House. But before we dance too much about this, remember, there are other cretins who would love to work in the Trump White House, and we have to be prepared that the replacements for Bannon and Gorka could be as bad, if not worse. Thanks for joining me for my News and Comment podcast. It's available on YouTube every day, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to